Good morning and shalom all. We are now on 1 Kings chapters 10 and 11, which in part deals with Solomon's wealth and wisdom. Reading from 1 Kings chapter 10 verse 1.
Chapter 10. And when the queen of Sheba heard of the fame of Solomon concerning the name of the Lord, she came to prove him with hard questions. And she came to Jerusalem with a very great train, with camels that bear spices, and very much gold and precious stones. And when she was come to Solomon, she communed with him of all that was in her heart. And Solomon told her all her questions. There was not anything hid from the king which he told her not. And when the queen of Sheba had seen all Solomon's wisdom, and the house that he had built, and the meat of his table, and the sitting of his servants, and the attendance of his ministers, and their apparel, and his cupbearers, and his ascent by which he went up unto the house of the Lord, there was no more spirit in her. And she said to the king, It was a true report that I heard in mine own land of thy acts and of thy wisdom. Howbeit I believe not.
Jumping to verse 9.
Blessed be the Lord thy God, which delighted in thee, to set thee on the throne of Israel, because the Lord loved Israel forever. Therefore made he thee king, to do judgment and justice. And she gave the king 120 talents of gold, and of spices very great store.
Jumping to verse 14. Sheba's returned to her land.
Now the weight of gold that came to Solomon in 1 year was 660 talents of gold.
The queen was a Gentile. Like other Gentile country leaders, she had heard of Israel's God, Yahweh, and came to respect him through Israel, or Solomon. That was and remains the purpose of God picking one nation and giving them his laws and blessings if they followed it, to be a light, meaning an example, to the other nations of the world. The deceiver wants Israel to turn away from God's laws so they do not get his blessings and thus do not set the example for others to come to Yahweh. We shall see this pattern as we read on. It is also the deceiver's strategy in our individual lives to teach that God's laws are old and not applicable as a means of salvation today. Do not be deceived by him. So far we have seen obedience to them is the way for judgment and justice, meaning being justified. Okay, moving on to verse 23 to 25.
So King Solomon exceeded all the kings of the earth for riches and for wisdom. And all the earth sought to Solomon to hear his wisdom which God had put in his heart. And they brought every man his present, vessels of silver and vessels of gold, and garments and armor and spices, horses and mules, a rate year by year.
Now prosperity preachers today fashion themselves on Solomon, having huge ties to come into their personal wealth weekly and annually. Solomon was a king of a nation. Preachers should fashion themselves on the Bible preachers as Elijah, John the Baptist, or even Messiah himself. John the Baptist was in a loincloth, for example. I suggest if your pastor is using funds for his or her own wealth rather than God's work and kingdom, stop giving it.
Do not be deceived that they need it to buy a plane, a private jet, to fly here and there to preach. Such preaching is only to enlarge their personal empire and congregation and bring them in more money via tithes and donations. Money on planes and personal luxuries can better be used to help the poor and dying and teach them about Yahweh, God's ways, by cheaper methods.
Or give it to in a way that makes sure it goes to God's work, which is not building up their churches to the bigger congregation. That is not necessarily God's work. Okay, moving on to chapter 11, reading from verse 1. Solomon turns from God.
Chapter 11. But King Solomon loved many strange women, together with the daughter of Pharaoh, women of the Moabites, Ammonites, Edomites, Zidonians, and Hittites, of the nations concerning which the Lord said unto the children of Israel, Ye shall not go in to them, neither shall they come in unto you, for surely they will turn away your heart after their gods. Solomon clave unto 700 wives, princesses, and 300 concubines, and his wives turned away his heart. For it came to pass when Solomon was old, that his wives turned away his heart after other gods, and his heart was not perfect with the Lord his God, as was the heart of David his father. For Solomon went after Ashtoreth, the goddess of the Zidonians, and after Milcom, the abomination of the Ammonites. And Solomon did evil in the sight of the Lord, and went not fully after the Lord, as did David his father. Then did Solomon build an high place for Chemosh, the abomination of Moab, in the hill that is before Jerusalem, and for Molech, the abomination of the children of Ammon. And likewise did he form all his strange wives, which burnt incense and sacrificed unto their gods.
The mixed race children of Solomon, many wives, including of the Edomites, will become part of the congregation of Israel, as would be their offspring. The meaning of fornication and the sole reason a man, as Yeshua said, can legitimately put away his wife is through fornication. Which means, like Solomon, she worships a pagan god, and in the risk of that is, as happened to Solomon, she turns you away from Yahweh God. We have seen Ruth left her God and came to Yahweh through Naomi. Now she's not, I assume, wasn't from one of these tribes above, I haven't checked. We did not read of Judah. We did not read of Judah, Joseph, or any other man going after the God of his wife. Maybe they were not from these 5 tribes. Fornication is not a sexual act, as most Bibles teach and preachers teach. Matthew 5:32 reads, But I say unto you, that whosoever shall put away his wife, saving for, except for the cause of fornication, causes her to commit adultery. Now we know adultery is a sexual act. If fornication is also a sexual act, how can the husband, putting away his wife, cause her to commit a sexual act, i.e. the adultery? If the sexual act happened before he put her away and was the reason why he put her away, he cannot cause her to do something she has already done, i.e. a sexual act.
Neither can fornication be
So
for unmarried
teaching
persons.
that fornication is sex outside marriage and adultery is sex inside marriage is not biblical. There is no thing really practically as sex outside marriage, because the persons are stoned. And the number one sin that God does not want people to do, as we have seen so far, is have a false God. That comes above sexual practices in or outside of marriages. Okay, continuing.
Sorry, I was about to say, neither can we say, as some people teach, that fornication is sex outside marriage, because Yeshua was using the word fornication in the context of marriage. So he's attributing fornication as a marriage term, or to be used to, yes? So not as the word teaches it, that fornication is sex outside marriage and adultery is sex inside marriage. Okay, let's continue.
From verse 9.
Because his heart was turned from the Lord God of Israel, which had appeared unto him twice, and had commanded him concerning this thing, that he should not go after other gods. But he kept not that which the Lord commanded. Wherefore the Lord said unto Solomon, Forasmuch as this is done of thee, and thou hast not kept my covenant and my statutes, which I have commanded thee, I will surely rend the kingdom from thee, and will give it to thy servant. Notwithstanding in thy days, I will not do it for David thy father's sake, but I will rend it out of the hand of thy son. Howbeit, I will not rend away all the kingdom, but will give one tribe to thy son for David my servant's sake, and for Jerusalem's sake, which I have chosen. And the Lord stirred up an adversary unto Solomon, Hadad the Edomite. He was of the king's seed in Edom. For it came...
So we have to remember that prophecy, because it will soon be coming true. The splitting of the tribes. Jumping on to verse 21.
And Hadad found great favor in the sight of Pharaoh, so that he gave him to wife the sister of his own wife, the sister of Tahpenes the queen. And the sister of Tahpenes bare him Genubath his son, whom Tahpenes weaned in Pharaoh's house. And Genubath was in Pharaoh's household among the sons of Pharaoh. And when Hadad heard in Egypt that David slept with his fathers, and that Joab the captain of the host was dead, Hadad said to Pharaoh, Let me depart, that I may go to mine own country. Then Pharaoh said unto him, But what hast thou lacked with me, that behold thou seekest to go to thine own country? And he answered, Nothing, howbeit let me go in anywise.
So God is stirring up people to come against Solomon. We continue from verse 29.
And it came to pass at that time, when Jeroboam went out of Jerusalem, that the prophet Ahijah the Shilonite found him in the way, and he had clad himself with a new garment, and they two were alone in the field. And Ahijah caught the new garment that was on him, and rent it in 12 pieces. And he said to Jeroboam, Take thee 10 pieces, for thus saith the Lord, the God of Israel, Behold, I will rend the kingdom out of the hand of Solomon, and will give 10 tribes to thee. But he shall have 1 tribe for my servant David's sake, for Jerusalem's sake, the city which I have chosen out of all the tribes of Israel. Because that they have forsaken me, and have worshipped Ashtoreth, the god of the Zidonians, Chemosh, the god of the Moabites, and Milcom, the god of the children of Ammon, and have not walked in my ways, to do that which is right in mine eyes, and to keep my statutes and my judgments, as did David his father. Howbeit I will not take the whole kingdom out of his hand, but I will make him prince all the days of his life, for David my servant's sake, whom I chose, because he kept my commandments and my statutes.
So we see why God is taking things away from Solomon, from not keeping his commandments, and why he did things for David for keeping the commandments. Jumping down to verses 37 to 43.
And me to put my name there. And I will take thee, and thou shalt reign according to all that thy soul desireth, and shalt be king over Israel. And it shall be, if thou wilt hearken unto all that I command thee, and wilt walk in my ways, and do all that is right in my sight, to keep my statutes and my commandments, as David my servant did, then I will be with thee, and build thee a sure house, as I built for David, and will give Israel unto thee. And I will for this afflict the seed of David, but not forever. Solomon sought therefore to kill Jeroboam. And Jeroboam arose and fled into Egypt unto Shishak king of Egypt, and was in Egypt until the death of Solomon. And the rest of the acts of Solomon, and all that he did, and his wisdom, are they not written in the books of the acts of Solomon? And the time that Solomon reigned in Jerusalem over all Israel was 40 years. And Solomon slept with his fathers, and was buried in the city of David his father, and Rehoboam his son reigned in his stead.
So we see that, like King Saul, when he kept God's commandments, God was with him. When he didn't, God appointed David to succeed him, and Saul tried to kill David. Same is repeated with Solomon. When Solomon obeyed God, God was with him. When he departed from God, God chose someone else to succeed him, and now Solomon wants to kill that person. So read and pay attention and remember the events of this chapter, as it forms a cornerstone in understanding the rest of the Bible and the coming of the Messiah. The 12 tribes of one nation and leadership have here become split into 10 and 2, Israel and Judah. They will go on to have separate kings and leadership. 10, Israel, will be taken into captivity and scattered by the Syrians, and later the 2, Judah, will be captured and taken to Babylon, where we read about Daniel and Jeremiah and so forth, and then they'll come back with Nehemiah and Ezra. The 2, as they will return after 70 years, as prophesied in Jeremiah chapters 25 verse 12, 29 verse 10, and Daniel chapters 9 verse 2. With Nehemiah and Ezra, but the 10 will remain scattered and become the lost tribe of Israel, as referred to in the New Testament. They will become what is known as Gentiles in the Gentile nations, where they were scattered until Matthew 15:24, when Yeshua said, But he answered and said, I am not sent but to the lost tribe of the house of Israel. Also read James chapters 1 verse 1, 1 Peter chapters 1 verse 1, and 2 Timothy chapters 1 verse 11, which refers to these 12 or 10 tribes, but it says the tribes scattered, but with intermarrying, it wasn't just purely 10 literally that were scattered, because people intermarried with each other. So within those 10 scattered, you had some intermarriages. In other words, parts of all the 12 tribes were scattered, in other words. Now, many times it is repeated in the chapter why God took action against Solomon for not keeping to the law. He rewarded David for keeping them, even to the extent of not taking all 12 tribes from David's lineage. And you also remember because of what Abraham did is how we ended up getting Israel, because of Abraham's obedience to God. It says because Abraham obeyed God's commandments, statutes, and judgments. In chapter 11:37, God repeats his instructions to the new person he's going to give 10 tribes to, if the condition of getting his favor and blessings is followed, then the new king will also get God's blessings. So are you still in doubt of the criteria? We have now come to the end of 3 initial kings leading the congregation of Israel, or the nation of Israel, after Moses and the judges. Some of the events will be repeated in Chronicles, but I hope you have understood the formation of Israel, the initial history from Abraham so far, and the directives God has given to God's people so far. Shalom, until tomorrow, God willing.